Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Emily Bowe, the Assistant Director here at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. You're joining us today for a talk with Rachel Cole to talk about her work at the Northwestern University Transportation Library and the modern work of archiving transportation history more generally. Before we begin our program today, I want to take note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to Indigenous peoples. The Massachusetts people lived for thousands of years and still live today on the Shawmut Peninsula. The metropolitan region is also home to other tribes, including Mashpee and Aquinnah-Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Copley Square, where the center is located and I'm sitting right now, sits atop a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. The maps that are in our collection bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts ranging from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, these maps don't simply document these stories, but actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Through all our programs and interpretation of the Leventhal Center, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real effects on the present day today. Today's talk is part of our ongoing exhibition, Getting Around Town, Mapping 4 Centuries of Boston in Transit. In the exhibition, which is free to visit 6 days a week in our gallery at the Central Library, we explore the long history of transportation infrastructure in and around Boston. The many historic maps in the show depict colonial-era ferry service, rapid expansion of the private railroad networks, the nation's first subway here in Boston, the modernization of the T, and unbuilt transit possibilities. Our teen curators worked with our K-12 education team to create their own maps for the exhibition that in many cases highlight the uneven ways that transit benefits different residents across the city. The exhibition celebrates a type of map that many might overlook, the functional utilitarian transit map that was equally likely to be on the walls of a subway station as it was to be in someone's pocket or purse. These kinds of everyday objects might seem unimportant compared to, say, a rare 17th century manuscript map, but a commonplace map of trains, trolleys, and buses can tell us so much about the society that lived with that transit system. The mere fact that someone at some point felt it important enough to keep these commonplace transit maps instead of pitching them in the trash is one of the main reasons our guest curator, Stephen Boucher, was able to put together an exhibition like Getting Around Town. So we are indebted to the work of the librarians, archivists, and collectors of the past who thought it important enough to preserve these documents for future citizens, historians, and policymakers. In today's talk, we're going to hear more about the formal work of actively trying to archive transportation history as part of the work of Northwestern University's Transportation Library, including what it means to think about documenting and recording contemporary transportation activism and the challenges of dealing with materials that aren't published through official channels. The Transportation Library's collections are vast, containing over 500,000 items and encompassing modes of transportation, including aviation, railroads, highway, maritime transportation, public transport, bicycle, and pedestrian networks. So it's no small endeavor. And with that, I will go ahead and bring on our speaker today, Rachel Cole, just as I briefly introduce her. Rachel is the curator and head of Northwestern University's Transportation Library, where she curates collections and exhibitions, directs instruction and outreach, and provides research support to students and faculty on the university's Transportation Center, as well as to a global community of transportation researchers. She works to make connections between current and historic collections, making the library's materials relevant, interesting, and accessible to a broad community of the researchers and the public. Prior to her work as a transportation librarian, Rachel worked as a research editor with Encyclopedia Britannica and with special collections libraries, including the Ryerson and Burnham Libraries of Art at the Art Institute and the Newberry Library in Chicago. So welcome, Rachel. We are thrilled that you could join us today, just one time zone over from us in Boston. And before I turn over fully to Rachel, there was already a note, but feel free to put questions or comments in the chat as we go through. We'll have a section for Q&A at the very end, but just want to make sure people know they can be actively sticking things there, so we'll get back to them. But with that, Rachel, I want to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about archiving the past and present of transportation. I'll be talking about our library here at Northwestern University's Transportation Library and our collections, as well as a little bit of transportation history as we go along. Let's see. There we go. So a little bit about the history of our library. We were founded in 1958 as the Transportation Center Library. The Transportation Center here at Northwestern was founded in 1954 And in part of their initial plans, they wrote in funding for collections and staff for a library, as well as a space for a transportation library within the center. So for our first several decades, we were housed within the Transportation Center. We've maintained really close ties with the center today. We also serve a large community of transportation researchers, both at the Transportation Center and across Northwestern. So I work with students regularly in the departments of history or English, for example, as well as a global community of transportation researchers. As Emily mentioned, our collections number over 500,000 items today, and we're located in Northwestern University's main library on the Evanston campus, just north of Chicago. There's a photograph of our reading room shown here. And our library is open to the public, so I hope as I'm talking today, there might be something that sparks your interest. You can learn more about us online, visit us, and get in touch with any questions that you might have. A little bit about our general collections today. This is not going to be a focus of the talk today, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the sorts of things that we do collect, similar to a traditional academic library, monographs, journals, and databases. Some of our acquisitions of recent years are shown here. Other current scholarly literature on transportation. This is really the core of our collecting efforts. So even though it's not sort of the focus of today's talk, it is important to what we do. This is all collected to serve the research and teaching needs of Northwestern faculty and students. The Transportation Center is heavily focused kind of in innovative transportation technologies. So today that might be things like automated, connected, electric, and shared mobility, or urban air mobility, as well as the impacts of our transportation systems on the environment, on social issues and equity. And so our collections are sort of formed around the work that they're doing there. The blurb for this event posits the question, what are transportation collections? So there are a variety of transportation collections. We happen to be a collection in an academic library, but there are also transportation collections at departments of transportation, federal, local, and state departments, as well as other university libraries. Special collections, for example, there might be a railroad archive inside a larger research library, as well as by private collectors. And we've been fortunate to have some of the really remarkable collections in the Transportation Library come to us from private collectors. Our collection is unique, though, in that we collect on the past of transportation, as well as the future of transportation. So it's a really interesting combination of work in civil and environmental engineering, which is what our Transportation Center works on, as well as rare books and historical materials and ephemera. We collect on all modes of transportation, so if it moves people or goods, it is something that we collect on. Our collection is particularly strong in railroads and aviation and sort of highway transportation, dating back to the 1950s when we began, but we also collect historical works earlier than that. I'm interested in building the collections in those modes, as well as increasing what we collect on pedestrian and bicycle transportation as well. We have strong collections of historical journals in the collection. Two of them are shown here. Very niche journals in some cases, things like Hydroplane and Hydrofoil magazine. But on the screen, you can see on the left is Flight Log. It's the magazine of the Association of Flight Attendants. This is the October 1974 issue that was celebrating maternity uniforms for flight attendants for the first time. It was accompanied by an article called The Plight of the Pregnant Flight Attendant that looks at the AFA working to bring airline policies more in line with federal law related to employment. On the right is Cat's Meow. It is the newsletter of the Chicago Area Transportation Study for its employees. Chicago Area Transportation Study was an early and influential planning study looking at land use and transportation in the Chicago area. This collection came to us from the library itself when it was disbanded several decades ago. Library employees brought materials to us at Northwestern's Transportation Library, and we catalog them and add them to our collection. This collection is part of our digitization efforts for this year, so I hope that the entire CATS collection will be live within the next few months online, accessible through HathiTrust for the general public. Flight log was likely a subscription that our library subscribed to when it was being published. It's no longer published in print, so unfortunately it's not something we subscribe to currently, but we do maintain these historical collections for users in years to come. So those are journals, but they also fall into this category of gray literature, which is research and reports that are published outside of the commercial publishing industry. They're not always collected by libraries and not often maintained by for the long term by libraries. In our collection, this includes things like employee or trade union newsletters, as you saw on the previous slide. Also things like planning studies and engineering reports, annual reports of transportation companies and operators, and things like conference proceedings from transportation conferences. For us, these documents might be published by entities like departments of transportation and other governmental agencies. On the screen here, you see a document on the electric and hybrid vehicles program published by the US Department of Energy. We also have materials by things like metropolitan planning organizations, engineering firms, or consulting agencies. It might sound dry on the outside, but I promise you it's interesting. I'll talk about some examples to share with you. One area of our gray literature collection that's interesting, I think, is the ways in which it can show things that we look at as innovative transportation technologies of today. So ride sharing or things like Uber and Lyft, though the technologies for them are new, the ideas go back many decades. So looking at these items in our collection to show the history of how these ideas might have evolved. Shown on the screen is a 1980 report from the US Department of Transportation titled Ride Sharing, Meeting the Challenges of the 80s. That's at left. And then at right is a record also from the US DOT called Sign Up for Ride Sharing, published in 1970. The report on the left, the task force is looking at increasing the percentage of Americans who carpool to work in particular for ride sharing. It was published in 1980, and the goal was to have 40% of all American trips to work is carpool by 1985, which did not happen. I'm going to read a little bit from the report's language because I just think it's really interesting and relevant for today too. The report's authors note that the rich appetite for gasoline reflects increased consumer incomes and choices and is fed in part by land use and development patterns that force a dependence on the automobile. Consequently, 90% of all trips Americans make are made by personal automobile. This means that almost every time someone leaves home to go to work, to shop, to school, or to a sporting event, the private automobile is the means of travel. This unparalleled degree of personal mobility has been achieved at the expense, at considerable cost in terms of energy and financial resources, and in many urban areas, environmental quality. The other interesting thing about this report, I think, is the way that it's illustrated. It has little toy cars illustrating the author's points. So on the screen, you can see the cars going along a windy highway that looks at some of the measures that the government might have used to encourage ride sharing. So things like insurance, laws and regulations, or fuel allocation. At the end of the report, the authors thank Montgomery Schoolhouse Inc., which was the maker of these toy cars, for allowing them to use the car in this report. So you'll see kind of a theme that goes through this presentation, I think, is the design of this gray literature materials and how it can sort of be a way of sparking public interest, I think, in something that may otherwise seem on the surface to be sort of a dull government report. When we see the strange illustrations of people in cars, or in the previous case of the cats report of a cat riding a broomstick holding a little planner holding a little planner, that these might be ways of encouraging people to take a deeper look into them. But these illustrations and photographs and art of interval reports is very rarely, if ever, credited. So these unknown illustrators and designers kind of bringing this, I think, personal touch to these reports, I think, is something else that's just really interesting to me. The record on the right, Sign Up for Ride Sharing, was a series of 8 commercials designed for radio. They have titles like Reformed Autoholic, and several feature Lorne Greene, who was an actor best known for his work on the TV show Bonanza. Another area that I think is interesting in our gray literature collections is this report on the feasibility of a monorail system for the New Orleans metropolitan area. It's a 1959 study conducted by Colonel Sidney H. Bingham, Bingham had been the general manager of the New York City Transit Authority for several decades before he retired in the mid-1950s to go into private practice as an engineering consultant. He worked for places ranging from New Orleans to Caracas, Venezuela, and his best known work for Walt Disney World as a consultant on the monorail system there. The other interesting thing about this report, which I discovered as I was pulling it for an open house last fall, was the illustrations. It's great, like futuristic space age suspended monorail system. And then you'll see the signature at the bottom right is Lowy, 59. It's Raymond Lowy, the prolific industrial designer who did a lot of really interesting work with transportation and who will come up later in this talk as well. Staying with New Orleans and with unbuilt projects, this is a sort of thank God it was never built project. In New Orleans, it's the Vieux-Carré Riverfront Expressway, originally proposed by Robert Moses in 1946 in his work as a consultant for New Orleans. It would have connected the Pontchartrain Highway in the south with Elysian Fields in the north, effectively cutting off the French Quarter and much of the district from the riverfront. You can see on the left some of the renderings, sort of like tendrils extending into the distance, cutting the city off from the river. And on the bottom is a rendering looking from the riverfront towards Jackson Square, the well-known public space in New Orleans and home of the St. Louis Cathedral, which is now a very well-used open public space, but would have been essentially cut off by the underpass of an expressway and a large noise-blocking wall. This project was under discussion for several decades. This report's from 1968. And finally, by 1969, due to great public opposition to this project, it was shelved and never came to be. And there's one more from Louisiana, just a random theme throughout this presentation or through the beginning. This is the Louisiana Department of Highways 1965 to 67 biennial report. And this, I just wanted to focus on the design of this report, which I think is really remarkable. Again, it's an uncredited artist, but the collage work here I just think is really spectacular. On the left, showing some of the bridges and infrastructure projects happening in New Orleans, in Louisiana. And then the center, the highway sort of winding through the bayou, around the trees and sort of integrating themselves into the landscape. I just think that's really fascinating. And then construction at right as well. So that brings me to annual reports, which are one of the special collections within our general collections in the library. We have a collection of over 18,000 annual reports from transportation companies and operators, particularly strong in railroads dating back to the 1930s in the US, 1830s in the US, as well as airlines, but other transit operators from the US and around the world, including things like taxi companies, pipeline companies, just a really rich source of information. I was helping a patron recently who had visited several archives and museums looking for this very specific piece of information about the ownership of a specific piece of track of railroad, and had not found that information anywhere that he had looked. I said, what do you think about checking out the annual reports? And so he did, and he found that information in the footnote of a 1950s era annual report from this railroad, and he referred to it as a needle in the book stacks. I told him I'm going to steal that phrase. I can't believe I've never heard it before. So we talk about that when we talk about searching for very specific and sometimes difficult to find information in our collections. So annual reports are interesting for company and financial information, but there's also a lot of really interesting cultural and social information often contained in annual reports as well. On the screen here is East African Airways 1965 annual report. East African Airways is an interesting case founded in the 1940s by colonial governments of what would become Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. And then when those companies attained their independence by 1963, they took local ownership of the airline. And there were a number of methods and measures designed at bringing the airline more in service of its own country people. So here's a page on training and Africanization. Prior to 1963, the majority of positions of leadership and management or in technical positions such as pilots or engineers, or in public serving roles like flight attendants might have been taken by Europeans. East African Airways' new leadership is working at Africanization of staff and bringing their own country people into positions of decision-making and power for the airline. I just love the image at the left as well. It's a flight attendant looking optimistically off into the future with her leopard skin pillbox hat. And behind her is the tail of an EA plane with the airline's logo of a yellow sun enclosing the flags of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Touching a little bit more on design and annual reports, this is Continental Airlines Jetstream logo, designed in 1968 by Saul Bass. We've all likely seen it before. I'd never seen the full context for this logo, though, until I came upon the airline's annual report for 1967. Published in 1968, showing the jet streaming through the red oval at the center of the screen, creating this jet stream. So I just thought that was such an interesting find, really showing Continental's place as part of the jet age. A little bit more on jet age transportation and annual reports. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, many companies, transportation companies, hired some of the best known graphic designers and illustrators and fashion designers of the day to create new brand images for themselves. On the left is Braniff International's 1965 annual report. Mary Wells Lawrence, who was a groundbreaking advertising executive, the first woman to own and operate her own firm on Madison Avenue, brought together this kind of dream team of architects and designers, including Alexander Gerard, who was responsible for a new typeface for the airline, which you see on the screen here, as well as everything from the color of airplane liveries to seat textiles and serving pieces. Also part of the project was Emilio Pucci, who is responsible for a line of uniforms for the airline, including the Gemini 4 flight attendant uniforms shown here, named after the spacewalk of that year. And the flight attendant at left, it's kind of difficult to see, but you may see that she has a bubble helmet on, just very futuristic space age, said later to protect flight attendants' helmets on windy tarmacs, but unsure if that's really the case. But either way, just really fun design there, celebrated in the annual report. And then on the right, it's the New Haven Railroad's 1954 annual report, designed by Herbert Matter, the Swiss-born graphic designer. This campaign was likewise conceived by a woman designer, Lucille McGinnis in this case, trained as a designer, married to the railroad's president, Patrick McGinnis, and she brought on board Matter, as well as Florence Knoll, and then an architectural team, including Minoru Yamazaki, Eero Saarinen, and Marcel Breuer to design stations for the railroad. Unfortunately, the following year, the New Haven went through a financial crisis, and McGinnis was fired from the railroad, and those architectural designs never came to be. But it's very interesting, I think, to see that celebrated in the annual report shown here. And McGinnis brought Herbert Matter with him when he went to the Boston and Maine Railroad. You'll see a design from that at the end of this presentation. The other sort of distinct collection within our general collections is our environmental impact statement collection. What is an EIS? It's a government document that is required under the National Environmental Policy Act, signed in 1970, anytime a federal agency does work that might have a significant impact on the environment. The agency is required to produce a report predicting the impact that might be, as well as looking at alternatives to that project, including not going through with the project as an alternative. A draft report is published, and then public feedback is welcomed and included in the final EIS, which is published. So EIS topics might include things like the built environment, so things like highways. They might also include things like the space shuttle program, or a ski area chairlift for Mount Hood Meadows, or a 3 Mile Island, or the discontinuation of car ferry service on Lake Michigan with the SS Badger. The collection numbers over 30,000 items in print, and many of these have been digitized as well and are publicly available in Hathi Trust. It came to us as a donation from faculty member Paul Friesma, who worked in the school's Environmental Policy and Culture Institute and who, upon his retirement, donated the collection to us. He acquired them by reading the Federal Register daily, looking for new EISs that were published and sending handwritten letters to the agencies that published them to request printed copies, which would arrive via US mail. He would use the coding manual shown on the screen here to code them along with his plans for using them in his work. And he and his students would store them in departmental offices. So there's a huge collection. They would joke about it making the floor collapse at some point because it was so many EISs. And upon his retirement, the collection came to us. His former student, Paul Culhane, remembers transporting the collection to our library in the back of a station wagon and wheeling items in on a library cart to go to cataloging and then eventually to transportation. So these are one of our best used collections by public staff and students. We get questions from federal agencies about this, from members of the public who are interested in the environmental impact of a project in their home area, and from students, as well as from professors who use EISs for topics such as showing students the governmental decision-making process that goes into works. I mentioned highway EISs earlier, and I think they provide some of the most interesting data and information among all of the EISs. On the screen is an EIS titled City Boulevard from Utah Street to Russell Street in Baltimore, published by the Federal Highway Administration and the Maryland Department of Transportation. The EIS looked at things including air pollution and noise pollution, as well as things like impact on the community, displacement, and jobs and income. On the screen, we see a little bit about demographic information of residents who are displaced as part of this project, and we see that it had a disproportionate impact on Black residents and low-income residents too. I thought this was also interesting in that it shows the names of some of the businesses that could potentially be displaced, and they're very clearly small businesses with names like Jerome Berry's Wagon Rental or Ethel's Beauty Shop. And I just think that kind of provides a personal window into how this highway construction may have disrupted and destroyed this neighborhood. So as I mentioned, EISs are extremely rich in information and data. This collection is largely digitized and can be found in HockeyTrust. And then on to our special collections. The special collections program at our library is relatively new. I mentioned that we date back to the 1950s, but we've been collecting special collections items in terms of things like rare books or passenger ephemera like menus or timetables, or photographs, postcards, sort of rare materials related to transportation. We've been collecting just for the past 15 years. This program was started under my predecessor, Roberto Sarmiento. And we've received a lot of really interesting collections from donors in terms, in particular, of our timetable and our menu collections. So on the screen here is a 1942 timetable from the Union Pacific and Northwestern Railroads with its famous fleet of streamliners. It comes from our William R. Huff collection. There's also biographical and interesting, I think, stories behind all of these collections as well, sort of how they came to be shaped, why they exist. Our collectors, I look at as sort of curators of their own collections too. So Huff has memories as a young child visiting with his dad, the different train yards, and traveling with his father. His father was also a collector, so it started Huff's interest in collecting. And he's accumulated a really fascinating collection of timetables, which he's donated to our library over the years. This is one example. We also have collections of menus. This is a railroad menu from the Empire Builder, a train of the Great Northern Railway. It takes its name from J.J. Hill, who was the founder of the Great Northern, and nicknamed the Empire Builder. Amtrak operates this route today. But this menu was from 1962 from our Ira Silverman Railroad menu collection. It was the year of the World's Fair in Seattle, so we see the Space Needle highlighted on the menu here. And then also these extensive options for food and dinner suggestions, including several course meal that starts with soup and then includes salad, a New York cut sirloin steak, rolls and potatoes, and dessert with your choice of cheese and toasted saltine crackers. Excuse me. Our menu collection, excuse me, I should say our Ira Silverman Railroad menu collection specifically is digitized and can be found in digital collections through the university libraries. Staying with food for a minute, railroads often had their own sort of specialty items. This is the Northern Pacific's Big Baked Potatoes. This is a die-cut trade card that was used to promote Northern Pacific services, in particular their Big Baked Potato, which was a selling item for the railroad. These potatoes would have weighed 2 to 5 pounds each and would have been served aboard Northern Pacific trains. They call themselves the route of the Great Big Baked Potato in some of their literature. And railroads often had sort of a specialty item. Here we're looking at the 20th Century Limited. There was a 20th century salad bowl that was associated with this train. Again, we see sort of this great design of the 20th Century Limited for the New York Central, through the menu as well as through passenger ephemera, again from our William Huff collection with the ephemera and from our Silverman collection with the menu. The 20th Century Limited was the New York Central sort of flagship train, designed by industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss, and released on the same day as competitor, I should say debuted on the same day as competitor railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad's Broadway Limited, which was designed by Raymond Loewy. This is not the Broadway Limited, it's an earlier train that Loewy designed for the railroad, but this is an example of books that are in our special collections. It's a 1937 volume called The Locomotive, Its Aesthetics. Just I think really interesting design and the title page there. And Loewy's sitting on the engine in the center photo. And it's really hard to see, but the previous owner of this volume wrote in pencil, it says, "This book is dedicated to this engine," and has an exclamation point. And indeed, Loewy dedicated this book to the engine that he designed. The preface concludes with, "For engine 3768, my heartiest wishes for a fast and brilliant career," which I just think is really charming. I'm going to read a little more from the preface because I think it's just, the entire thing is just very, very sweet. Loewy writes, "Unable to control an irresistible craving to sketch and dream locomotives at the oddest moments, it was a constant source of trouble during my college days and the despair of my professors. Later, as a young man, it led to my complete oblivion as a dancing partner, for I spent long, enchanting hours at the locomotive depot instead of taking scheduled dance lessons. I have no regrets. In recent years, it has been my privilege to design all sorts of things, such as streamlined ships, transcontinental motor buses, automobiles, and electric engines. Never did I dream that my career as an artist engineer would lead me to someday to that glorious adventure, the designing of a steam engine." We'll move into airline menus. This collection is also digitized. Actually, we have 2 airline menu collections. There's the Robert M. Baer collection, which is currently being digitized, and then there's a larger transportation library menu collection, which is already in digital collections. But this is an example of Bob Peak's series for TWA. Bob Peak was an illustrator and designer who was best known for his movie poster design. He designed the posters for My Fair Lady and Apocalypse Now, and Star Trek, the motion picture, which is shown on the right of the screen too. So the menu on the left is the 1973 menu that he designed depicting Hong Kong, part of a series of menus illustrating cities around the world. And I just think it's really interesting to see how that sort of leads into the movie poster for Star Trek, sort of that vertical rainbow design and like the figure sort of behind the scenes sort of in the background. And so just I think a really interesting piece of art in our menu collection. Another from this series was for Madrid. This is from the Transportation Library menu collection, donated by George M. Foster, who's one of our donors, who collected menus and timetables. He left notes on the items that he donated, often on menus in particular. So you can see sort of to the top left of the menu, it says GMF, his initials. Occasionally an item might be collected by his wife, Mickey, so it would say MLF for her initials. He'll note where the plane is traveling. So in this case, it's DC to San Francisco. The type of plane, in this case, a 707. And he writes underneath, Chateaubriand, excellent and good service. And then to the right of the screen, you can see the Chateaubriand and other various options for dinner above TWA's jets. Just one more menu to share. This is a 1971 menu from Alitalia. It's a first-class menu, but the engraving shown on the cover is from 1903. It's called La Minerve. It was a satirical print looking at the hot air balloon craze of its day. So in our library, we're often talking about collecting sort of the innovative transportation technologies of today and working to share those. In the past, the hot air balloon really was the transportation technology of its day. So the satirical print shows a military sort of ship suspended by a balloon with a rooster perched on top with a flag, and then all sorts of fanciful illustrations, wings on the balloon, a bird cage. I think a really fun image on this menu from our David Toms collection. And then I would be remiss if I did not share some maps from our collection. These items are from our early automobile company's ephemera collection. On the left is an automobile map of Chicago, published in 1910 by Commonwealth Edison. And you may ask yourself, why would ComEd publish an auto map? Well, these are all electric vehicle charging stations in Chicago. This is a small range of Chicago streets, about 3 miles, I believe, on the north, going north of the loop, and south as well, and extending to the west side. So this is just a small segment of Chicago. And each of the little dots that you see is an electric vehicle charging station that would have been available to the public. And each of the red lines you see is a good road that would have been accessible and drivable no matter what the weather conditions were. Back in 1910, if it was rainy or snowy, you could encounter roads that you might not have been able to traverse depending on the condition of the road. So those are in red. And then another item from this collection at right is from Lincoln Electric from the 1910s. It was a small card aimed at promoting electric vehicle charging stations from Lincoln Electric. And it reads, "It makes charging as easy as driving," just kind of demonstrating that electric cars we may think of as a new technology today, but it dates back to the very early years of the 20th century as well. So you could have had your own in-home charging station from Lincoln Electric. This map, I think, is really interesting. It's from our William Huff collection again, and it looks so much to me like an electrical diagram. It made me think of the London Underground map from 1931, designed by Harry Beck, who was an electrical engineer himself, and created the first map, which is largely thought to have been more diagrammatic rather than geographically accurate, and sort of served as a basis for transit maps going forward from there. But never have I seen a map that looks more like an electrical diagram than this map from Trans-Europe Express from 1958. Route maps also appear throughout our collections, particularly in our timetable collections and in our annual reports as well. This is a timetable from Royal Air Maroc from 1966. You can see the cover at right, and then the route map of the airline printed inside the timetable. I just think it's a really wonderfully abstracted map of the airline services, starting in Casablanca, its hub, and then throughout France and Germany into Algeria and Tunisia as well. This is an example of a map from a railroad. It's the National Railways of Mexico's fall-winter 1962 timetables from our Huff collection again, and it's showing the routes from the railroad's hub in Mexico City out to Teotihuacan, and various parts, various locations throughout the country for tourists. I wanted to share a few items of transit ephemera as well. This is from our David L. Phillips collection. Phillips was a longtime CTA employee who I think had a really great eye for collecting with design in mind in particular. So these are 3 items from his CTA ephemera portion of his collection. He also collected on railroads and airlines, just a really broad and fascinating collection that he thankfully donated to our library. On the left is Chicago Surface Lines from 1934. It's a brochure and route map for surface line service in 1934 during the World's Fair of that year, which was the Century of Progress exhibition. So you can see sort of in the design of this, the great Art Deco design of that fair built into the design for this report. Its center is a brochure from 1949 showing the all-new North-South Express service that the CTA was operating. The CTA, Chicago Transit Authority, came into being only in 1947 when it consolidated the services, or brought together, I should say, the services of Chicago Surface Lines, which was the surface transit operator in Chicago, as well as Chicago Rapid Transit Company, which operated our L's. So this pamphlet from just a couple of years later showing some of the services that CTA introduced soon after coming into being. And then on the right is this really fun brochure pamphlet from 1968 called How to Ride a Bus. It shows a GM fishbowl bus on the cover. These were affectionately nicknamed by Chicagoans the green limousines. And it included sort of etiquette guidelines for passengers for how to ride a bus. Things like do not ride on walls, do not put your feet on seats, don't throw candy wrappers, milkshake containers, or pop bottles on the floor. Keep your head and arms inside the bus and ask for a transfer when boarding. Don't carry unnecessary conversations with the operator. So the operator of the bus at the time would have been expected to drive as well as make transfers and change. It sounds like a very complicated position in its day. This is also from the Phillips collection. I just think this is such an interesting and beautiful item. It's called Black Europe. It's from TWA. This campaign from TWA, together with a Black-owned travel agency called Elsewhere Holidays, Inc., was largely referred to as the first major Black-oriented European vacation program. The two planned together. The illustrations come from Ernest Critchlow, who was a fantastic painter of the mid-century. I recommend looking up his artwork if you're not familiar. I hadn't been until I came across it in this brochure, but it's just really fantastic. And the authors of this text are talking about how it is a grand tour that will inform and open your eyes and give you the greatest swinging ball of all time, a tour that will turn you on. Black art, Black theater, Black history, Black food, and Black folks. All this and the Eiffel Tower too. So just looking at how travel service of the airlines was promoted in the 1970s, I think is just really fascinating here. A few more examples of timetables from our George M. Foster collection. Sudan Airways at left. We talked a little bit earlier about African Airlines in the 1950s and 60s. Sudan had achieved its independence just a few years earlier than this in 1956 and established its own national airline that very same year. The timetable shown on the screen here is from 1961. At the center of the screen, we have a Pan Am timetable from 1958 for 707 service. This was the first 707 service in the US and in existence, and it is largely thought of as the beginnings of the jet age. So this is the first 707 timetable. I think it's really interesting how it really features jets as part of the timetable's illustrations. And then on the right is the first timetable for 747 service from Pan Am. A couple more timetables from Amtrak. These are from November 14th, 1971. Just about 6 months after Amtrak came into being, they'd consolidated the service of some 21 passenger railroads across the US, which had been losing money, were looking to abandon their services, and the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1971 brought them together and was an attempt to save passenger rail service in the United States. We see a passenger agent holding a model of a rail car at center, and the text is Amtrak, we're making the trains worth traveling again. All we ask is for a little patience. So sort of looking at how Amtrak presented itself to the customer soon after its founding. Looking at areas that I'm interested in bringing more of into the collection, this is something that was purchased just several months ago, 2 items that were purchased several months ago, looking at road safety and children and the history of that. So prior to the 1920s and the dominance of the automobile, the road had been much more of a shared space. for children, for example, pedestrians, streetcars, horse-drawn vehicles, even a place for children's play. So think things like stickball, which was a street sport. As the automobile came more into a dominant position in our cities, those activities that had been part of the street had to be moved off of the street to make room for the automobile. Children were particularly impacted by the dominance of the automobile in this era, and not only that they had to move off streets, but they were disproportionately affected by traffic violence. So I'm talking about injuries or deaths from traffic crashes. So on the screen here, we have two items seeking to promote children's safety during the 1920s on the left and 1940s at the right. But they also sort of, I think, shift the burden of safety from the driver onto the child or the pedestrian. So at left, we have Play Safe with the Games We Love, a pamphlet published kind of directing children to play on the sidewalk, stay off the street, play safe. And then on the right, from the Automobile Club of Michigan, it's Safety Songs from 1945, in which the automobile company encouraged children to write songs promoting automobile safety. So one example is to the tune of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. And it is, my Bonnie lies over the ocean. My Bonnie was careless, you see. My Bonnie was not careful at crosswalks. Oh, bring back my Bonnie to me. And again, I think this sort of shifts the burden of traffic safety from the driver, the member of the Automobile Club of Michigan, to Bonnie, who is just trying to cross the street safely. I'm also interested in documenting advocacy movements for bicycle and pedestrian and transit infrastructure and policy. So this is a historical item that I purchased recently. It documents a 1971 rally to encourage bikeways legislation and to fight auto pollution in Honolulu in 1971. So the cover of the album shows a photograph of the flyer for the bike-in, and then there are photographs of the bike-in happening at right. You see a wide group, it looks like hundreds of people, including children and adults, working for safe bikeways in Honolulu. Today, the sort of collecting looks like something like the Transportation Advocacy Archive, which is something I started last year, working to sort of tell the stories of the advocates and activists who are working to influence transportation policy, particularly here in Chicago. This is from Commuters Take Action, which is a local group working for better public transportation here in Chicago, working to improve CTA service and frequency and working conditions for operators. So this archive is new, relatively. We have a few items that are in print, as well as digital items as well, which I've worked with our digital archivist to collect. But just two of the items that we have as printed materials are shown on the screen here. This is like a business-sized card at the left. It says, "We're not the CTA, we just haunt them." And on the back, it includes a QR code where riders are encouraged to scan and submit information about maybe, for example, a ghost bus, which there's a ghost on the card here. A ghost bus is a bus which is on the schedule. You'll see it on your transit app, for example, and it just never shows up. So they're tracking all of that data. And on the right, some of that data comes into being in the schedule. It's for the California Blue Line station. It looks like a CTA schedule that a Chicagoan would expect to find in print. But what they're doing is they're looking at the average advertised intervals between trains and then the actual intervals between trains. And those numbers can really be pretty far off in many cases. So I think this will be an interesting collection to researchers now and in the future who are sort of looking to see how our transportation conditions came to be shaped at this era in history, including through the input of advocates and activists. I hope to build this collection to a larger scale in the future. Quickly mention our poster collection. These are two posters that we acquired within the last year, kind of designed to promote our collections widely to our students. They will often, we have reproductions hung in the reading room, and they'll start conversations with students who will come to us and say, what the Metro liner, one of the fastest trains in the world, I want to learn more about that, for example. So just intended as, starting points of conversation with our students. And then finally, I've mentioned a couple of times kind of looking at the historical legacies of some of the transportation innovations that we have today. So again, electric cars I mentioned the early 20th century. I think the 60s and 70s are also a fascinating era. On the left, we have Ford's Communicar, which is from 1967. And on the right, we have Sears XDH1. DH stands for Die Hard, is in the Die Hard battery. This was an experimental car. Sears never intended to produce it for the consumer market, but they did look at themselves as a potential producer of batteries for electric cars. So the XDH1 was powered by 20 Die Hard batteries. And I think these pamphlets and photos in our collection help to illustrate this story. So that's it about our collections. There's a lot there, but I hope that I've summarized them in a way that's interesting and that it will lead to potentially some interesting research questions for viewers in the future. You can get in touch through you can find us through the link, the website shown here on the screen, library.northwestern.edu/transportation. There you can find our digitized collections, our catalog, finding aids, and digital exhibits as well. And then we're also on social media on Instagram and Twitter. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. That was really, really amazing. It's always so fun to have someone who knows a collection so well take you through it and kind of give you all of the interesting high points, but also understand the range. And it really does seem like there's quite a range. And we only saw, a small portion of kind of what I know is in the collection. So that was super exciting. We had one. There was a viewer in the chat, Ivan, who said he's a transportation engineer currently based in Boston, learning about this amazing field, and he was very excited to learn about all the history. So lots of fans.
Excellent.
We do have a couple questions that are already in the chat. So I'm going to start with a really great question from someone who asked, does the library have any arrangements with transit agencies to receive stuff like advertising and wayfinding materials that they might not otherwise archive?
That is such a wonderful question. It is not something we currently have in place, but it's definitely something that I've thought of and something that I'd love to have. We talk frequently with our local transit agency here, and so they have sent materials to us in the past and kind of specific donations to us. But on a large scale, we don't have an agreement in place, although it's something that I would love to have. I came into this role about 1.5 years ago and wish often that I had been here during the COVID-19, the height of the COVID-19 epidemic in particular. I think it would have been really interesting to collect materials on transit agencies and how they handled public safety during that era. But unfortunately, no. But thank you for that question. It's something that I would love to see happen in the future. Love to make happen.
Yeah. There's kind of another related question that it comes from Pangloss. Like, seems the average government report or public communication from the mid 20th century was so much more thoughtful about visual design than similar publications today. Why do you think that is?
That's such a great question too. I was just recently having this same conversation, a conversation about the same topic with a colleague, and sort of bemoaning the fact that we have these great, especially with annual reports, I think, celebrated designers working on them. It's just not something you see anymore. The reasons for that exactly, I'm not entirely sure. I'd love to learn more about it. But one thing that I think is particularly at play here is the widespread use of computers and computers as design programs, sort of bringing things into more standardization, particularly from transit agencies. So with computer design, I think it was easier for templates to be designed for an entire agency or things to be designed in a more formalized or standardized manner than what we have today. But I'm also very curious about that question about particularly the well-known designers of our day, and why don't we see that turn up as much in this sort of literature?
Yeah, well, and I mean, that brings up, I think, a really interesting thing that I'm curious about. And I certainly don't expect you to have the answer on this, because I know there are literally so many hundreds and thousands of archivists and librarians that are currently grappling with these issues. But for born digital materials, so today, right, if there's a transportation project that's being planned, most of the public facing communications are either on a website or they're PDFs or they're some other kind of digital file. And so I guess I'm curious to sort of understand what, from your perspective, like what are the challenges there? What are the benefits of maybe the file already being in digital format? PDFs are notoriously like probably the most common form of things, but they pose their own set of challenges. So I would love to hear you just kind of reflect on both the like challenges and opportunities that born digital materials give your collection.
Thank you. I think that the problem of born digital materials is one of the real challenges that I face, particularly with collecting, I think, special collections items. For example, I think that our students really are able to connect with items when they're able to hold them physically, and something sort of lost when it's translated to the digital. I was working with a student a few years ago who I showed a transit map of Seattle from the 1980s too, and just as part of his research, he was looking at the whether sort of median transit had been considered for highways in Seattle in the period. And so he was amazed. He'd seen this map online before, and he couldn't believe that he was seeing the physical map in person. And he said, "Can I touch it?" Yes. So I think that that's something there that's lost as we move to digital. And I have spent many hours in touch with transportation companies, particularly electric vehicle producers, and that sort of company, trying to seek print materials, and they're just not produced anymore. In terms of planning projects, yes, you're right, the PDFs of materials are something that we're interested in collecting. I'm lucky to have experts that work in the library here that know more about how the technical side of all of that works. So I work with our acquisitions department to identify projects, or I've had faculty members identify projects as well that they might be interested in acquiring materials on. And then so we'll work with our acquisitions department to save a PDF of that if it's something that's able to be done, and have it cataloged for our catalog. That's more for the sort of reports and technical side of things. For things that might go into something like the Transportation Advocacy Archive, we have a digital archivist who's specific to that, who's able to archive things like websites or social media feeds. There's a project that that's underway called the Transportation Twitter Archive, where we're working to archive Twitter accounts and conversations that have happened in this public space for years, as Twitter is on a decline of sorts. So there are people working in the library that are able to kind of work on the technical side of these things. I think some of the challenges include that it's more difficult to get them. In the past, we were able to have subscription, for example, to the reports of an agency, or be in contact with a librarian who would send us printed copies, and it's just not something that's available to us anymore. So it's more, I think, of a hands-on process of identifying what's interesting to us and going out and seeking it, and a more labor-intensive process, I guess. It is always helpful to have materials that are digitized, because we do get a lot of questions from patrons from around the world, and it's nice to be able to say, "Oh, we have this link. Here's a link to what we have saved through our library."
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely seems like being able to sort of share those things super easily once they've been digitized becomes, I mean, we notice that on our end as well with our collection. That becomes one of the best ways to connect with patrons or visitors. We've got one more question, unless there's another one in the chat, which is kind of reflecting a little bit. It seems like much of the collections you showed us, a lot of, I mean, maybe less so the kind of federal government documents, but many of the other reports or timetables or menus are from companies that are now defunct, right? It's sort of, going through some of the names in your presentation, it was sort of like a corporate graveyard of transportation companies that no longer exist. And I wonder if you have any kind of reflections on that as sort of an inevitability of companies that were the startups of their day that just didn't make it, or kind of what are the larger pieces of maybe American policy or other things that you think are kind of that you notice the effects of, just with these kind of all these defunct companies and their records that may end up in your collection?
Oh, that's such a great question. It's not something I've really thought about in those terms before. I think that, as you mentioned, I think it sort of resonates with me that you talked about sort of the startup companies of their day. I think that it's really interesting to see how transportation has changed, and how that's represented in our collections. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for that question.
Okay.
It's a really great question. Thank you.
I threw you a curveball at the very, very end, so that's all good. Well, I'm going to start wrapping things up just because we've hit our hour mark. So if anyone wants to sneak in a last minute question, they'll have probably like another minute to do so before I finish. But yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. This was amazing. And if for anyone watching who's in Boston, please come by our gallery and you can see many of these kinds of maps that Rachel was talking about. One, I'm going to stick in the chat for any eagle-eyed visitors or viewers today who were noticing the thumbnail of the map that is on the video itself. It's from a 1982 map in our collection, system map of the T, but it includes all kinds of ads and different things from that period of time, including an ad for the Boston Museum of Transportation on Congress Street, which no longer exists. So very interesting kind of example of things like what Rachel is talking about that you can come see in person any day with a research appointment or in the gallery. And with that, if you are interested and not already on our newsletter, please join our newsletter. You can get there from our website. There's a button up top that says subscribe. That's the best way to keep up with any of future events we're doing. This Friday, we are sharing our classroom space with representatives from the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics and the North American Indian Center of Boston for our From the Vault series, highlighting collections that showcase native-led cartographic practice. And then in December, we have two different author talks, one on December 12th with Neil King Jr. here at the Central Library, and one on December 20th with Jake Berman, who's just written a new book that's called The Lost Subways of North America. So if you want to get your transit nerd on through the end of the year, please join us on December 20th. And yeah, I don't see any more questions. So with that, I just want to thank Rachel again and thank everyone for tuning in. And finally, thank the mobility team at the Bar Foundation. They're the ones who sponsored our exhibition and all of our public outreach and events for the next few months. So we're very grateful for their support. But thank you all. Bye, Rachel.